Okay, good afternoon, everybody. What a lovely afternoon for staying in and not having to walk to the shore for sage. Just a couple of things from me before we kick off with this afternoon's speaker. Hopefully, you've all got the September Sage newsletter, the corrected copy. Sorry, there are a couple of typos on the first one, but you've now got an updated one. You can see a full program for September, 5 weeks. And a fortnight today, we shall have Leslie, our own cook, helping you cook your honey cakes for Rosh Hashanah. So you should have all your ingredients and utensils lined up ready for a fortnight today, and we can do real live cooking of honey cake. Okay, on to this afternoon's program. I'm delighted to welcome Shlomo Kreiman, or should I say Judge Shlomo Kreiman.
That's a bit more like it.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll correct me as you did last week. On this afternoon, we're privileged to have what I would call an intriguing guest speaker. Many of you will know him by sight as a resident in Edgware and a sometime worshipper at Edgware United Synagogue. Some refer to him as the Judge, but few really know who he is, excuse me, and what he does exactly. And I've made a few inquiries about him, and I better get it exactly right, because last week, when I made a slight error in a number of years, he threatened to haul me up before the bench. So I don't want that. So listen to what I'm going to say now about Judge Kreiman. Shlomo Kreiman qualified as solicitor over 40 years ago. He practiced in suburban and central London in various areas of the law. In 1990, he became senior partner of a firm of lawyers in Ilford in northeast London. In 1998, he was appointed as a district judge in the criminal courts, and the following year as a tribunal judge dealing with social security, housing benefit, child support, and disability appeals. He also spent a few years as chair of the NHS London Appeals Panel, which looked at decisions of clinical commissioning groups adjudicating continuing care costs of chronically disabled patients. All that apart, he became a minister of the United Synagogue on the 1st of February 1981. He occupied pulpits in Romford, Hove, and the Central at Great Portland Street, and has also addressed our own community on more than one occasion. I'm sure you join me in wanting to hear just what he has to say, if only in his own defence. So, without further ado, I invite him to address us today, and perhaps I should close by saying, all rise, here comes the judge. Over to you.
Stuart, as a hesped goes, it's the best one that's ever been written in my lifetime. Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon. This is Edgware broadcasting to the British Empire, wherever you may be. I hope you can all hear me. Fortunately, I can't hear you. I can see some of you, but it isn't an awful lot to shout about. So, after 22 years on the bench, I retired on the 31st of May, a mere spring chicken of 35, or maybe it was 65, who's counting? And I'm going to talk to you this afternoon a little bit about that period of my life, 22 years sitting as a judge. I'm sure by the look of you, one or two of you have been in the dock and will know what it's like, but for those of you that haven't, well, it'll be something of a revelation. Let's start, as they say at the very beginning. Let's start by talking about how one becomes a judge. There's a lot of mystery and glamour attached to it all. I promise you, in reality, it's a very different story. I applied back in 1997 when it was suggested to me that I might make the grade if I did. One had to collect referees, not the people that stand on the pitch at Stamford Bridge or anything like that, but people who were going to write something nice about the applicant. And having collected my 3 judicial referees, I put in my application form. Much to my surprise, I was invited for an interview. And having got past the interview, I had to spend a week doing what's called sitting in. It's a bit like shadowing a real life judge, although if I mention shadowing, it's got nothing to do with Cliff Richard. Having passed that, very slow this afternoon, people, you've got to listen out for the jokes. Having passed that, there was then a week's induction at what was a beautiful place. It was originally the country house of Thomas Cook, the estate agent, and where they discovered for the first time the existence of a company called Hermolis that does kosher meals for people out and about. They'd never heard of them. Nobody had ever asked for them before. And I told them, if you don't get Hermolis meals in for me, well, you won't be seeing me in a hurry. So that was good. And then I was let loose. Now the process is far more complicated. There are online tests. There are telephone pre-interviews. There are dummy court appearances to conduct. It's a whole gefährlich. But why that may be is perhaps that when I went in for it, there were 30 places and some 300 candidates. Now for the same biannual 30 places, there are normally over 1,500 candidates. So you have to sift very carefully. So that's how you get to be a judge. And if you're really good, you get one of the, I don't know if you can see these, you get one of these wonderful badges to wear, which has got the royal crest on, my picture, and identity. And so you can walk into a court anywhere, and whilst they'll let you in, whether they'll let you out again is another matter entirely. Now let's look at the jobs that I've done. I want to make it clear that all the views I express today are personal. They're not on behalf of the Lord Chancellor or the court service. And just to tell you that at the end, you will have plenty of time to ask any questions arising. Now let's talk about the criminal courts first, because that was the first job that I went into. Now, most people think of a criminal court as one having a judge and jury. The judge done up in a wig and robes, and the jury of 12 good people sitting on the side. At the end of the day, the judge is the judge of the law, the jury is the judge of the facts, and make the decision whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. Being a district judge, which is one level down, is however a bit different, because there is no jury. I'm also pleased to tell you there's no wig and gowns and all that performance, because it would be very difficult to see where the white bit of the wig finished and the white beard started. So I sat entirely alone, no adjudicators or anything like that, and I was the judge and jury combined in the court. Now, all criminal matters start before a district judge, from murder downwards. You name it, they go there. And in fact, I have had my name in the paper for dealing with one or two rather famous murderers who appeared before me briefly on their way to the Old Bailey. The most recent one I did was a chap called Stephen Port. Mr. Port was famous because he had a penchant for other men, and having invited them round to his home and did whatever it was that they did, he then murdered them, schlepped them, that's a legal term, schlepped them to the local churchyard and buried them. And after he'd done about 5 of them, someone became suspicious, and the police were alerted, and he was duly arrested. And he came before me. It was a Monday morning at Redbridge in East London, and it was quite amusing because as I arrived at the court, there were photographers, cameramen, a whole body of reporters hanging around. They had no idea who I was, and in my rather typical fashion, as I walked past, I smiled and I said, "No interviews today, boys," and I had no idea who I was. So the court was packed with reporters. In I stride, they all stand up, of course, and he's first on the list, called into court, and as the reports always tell you, He spoke only to confirm his name, address and date of birth, because that's all he had to do. I sent him off in custody to the Old Bailey for trial. But my name appeared in the Evening Standard, the Times, the Daily Mail, and I had a number of relatives and friends ringing up. I think they were disappointed I wasn't the one in the dock, but that's another story for another day. Yes, now here's a good point. When the judge walks in, everybody stands up. And it's a point that many people don't understand. They're not standing up for the individual judge. Above the judge's head on the wall behind him is the royal coat of arms. And the judge represents Her Majesty the Queen. And what they're standing up for is in deference to her, not the individual judge. So any judge who thinks he's any judge who, I hear voices, some interference there. Any judge who thinks that he or she is, shall we say, God's gift to the judiciary is in for a bit of a shock. Let's look at the work we do in these courts. It's a very broad range. I've mentioned murder, anything of a violent nature. There's a lot of drugs. Now, we all know about the drug problem in this country. There's a lot of drugs issues that come into court. I will, however, tell you one story that occurred at Southend Court, which was quite amusing. I think you'll see the funny side of it. So there was a gentleman living in Brixton. Brixton, some of you may know, is in South London, and is widely populated by the Caribbean community. And this gentleman was, and I say it not as a racist comment, but as a matter of fact, he was black, and he was a small-time drug dealer. But the competition in Brixton was quite high, so he decided to go off and chance his arm somewhere else, and he went off to Southend. And there he was, walking around with his merchandise, and a van drew up, and two gentlemen in blue uniforms got out. And they spoke to him, and they arrested him under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. So they asked for his name, and he gave a false name. They asked for his address, and he gave what he thought was a false address in Southend. Unfortunately for him, the address he gave was a real address in Southend. And one of the officers said, "I know where that is. We'll put him in the van and go round there." So they drive round to the address, bang on the door, and the door is opened by a young white female. And one of the officers says, "We have your fellow in the back of the van. We've picked him up for drug dealing." "Oh," she said, "I've told him so many times not to do that. He's bound to get caught. What a fool." So the officer said, "Well, may we come in and do a search without a warrant?" "Oh," she said, "you might just as well." And they picked up the usual paraphernalia, the scales, the little plastic bags and all that sort of thing. And they then arrested her as an accessory, took her out, opened the back of the van, whereupon she sees the man and says, "Who the hell's this?" or words to that effect. And they said, "Well, this is your bloke." And she said, "I've never seen him before in my life." So the old adage, buy one, get one free, came to pass, and they both appeared in court the next day in front of me. I do have to tell you, the whole court was in difficulty keeping a straight face as we dealt with it. And as you can imagine, they both copped out big time. Apart from drugs, there's a lot of road traffic. Anybody who has ever contravened road traffic law will know that you end up in front of the bench unless you agree to pay some sort of financial penalty quickly. It's going through a red light, speeding, driving without due care and attention, all that sort of thing. But here I learnt a lesson. Again, as it happens, and this is coincidence, it was Southend Court. And the road traffic lists that you get to deal with are very heavy. There's always lots of people. And we're wandering through the list in the course of the morning. And in comes the next defendant, a young chap, followed by a much older man who goes and sits in the gallery. So the young fellow pleads guilty, and I impose a fine. And I said, can you pay the fine today? No, he said, I don't have the money. I said, well, would your father have the money? My father, he said, rather quizzically. I said, the older gentleman who came in with you and sat at the back. Oh, he said, that's not my father, that's my partner. There was a second silence, and I said, well, I don't care what you call him. Has he got the money? And the man nodded. I said, very well. I said, pay today. Thank you very much. At lunchtime, the clerk said to me, you do realise that will go round the court in no time at all. I said, yes. I said, one should never presume. It's always a risk. But it was quite amusing at the end of the day. Now, of course, one of the big issues in court is the issue of bail. In other words, someone who is arrested on a more serious matter may have their liberty taken away by the police, and it's a question for the court, that is to say me, whether they get their liberty back or whether I remand them in custody. Obviously there are a number of statutory factors that one has to look at. The seriousness of the matter, whether they've got any previous convictions, what the risk is if they're released, all those sorts of things. And in many cases, the risk is so great that there is no option other than to remand them in custody, which is always a matter of last resort. But if it needs to be, well, it needs to be. The last day I sat, I heard a domestic violence matter. Two young people in a sort of on-off relationship. And when she came back late one night drunk, he went for her, tried to strangle her, and we saw some photographs of the injuries. And his advocate pointed out to me that this young fellow was coming up to his 21st birthday in a couple of days, and he'd rather celebrate it with his family than looking at the walls of, I think, Pentonville Prison. But that did not impress me because the girl's safety was plainly at risk. We do a lot of domestic violence work in the courts, and it is quite astounding the amount that goes on and the way in which people treat each other who are supposed to be, quote, partners, unquote, or even are married to each other. Now, it's also right to say that there are higher courts, and matters that require greater powers of sentencing, for example, go to a higher court called the Crown Court. Those of you who have been around a long time may remember there was a television series many years ago called Crown Court. I can see, Daphne, you remember that. Obviously wasted a lot of your time watching television when you should have been doing other things, but we won't hold that against you this time. It did figure on some highlighted cases. So, how are we doing for time? We're doing okay. You should also know that once someone is appointed as a judge, that isn't the end of the story. They have regular training events. At least once a year, they do a residential course, and sometimes twice a year. And you have to go off and sit in a class like a good pupil judge and keep up to date with developments in the law and how it's all working, so that you know what you're doing when you're sitting in the big red chair. Strangely enough, there was a play on in the West End, Witness for the Prosecution, at the end of last year. Some of you may have been to see it. It was very well done. It was on at County Hall, as it used to be. And I went with a friend of mine, and we saw it, and it was based on an Agatha Christie. It was very, very well presented. And at one point, the court was assembled and they were waiting for the judge to come in, and the clerk got up and said, "All those having business before my lords, the Queen's justices, draw near and give your attention." And he paused for a second, and under my breath, as a reaction, I said, "God save the Queen." And then he said, "God save the Queen." And the woman sitting next to me looked in astonishment. At the end of the play, she said, "How did you know the next line?" Well, I said, "You see that big red chair up there?" So she said, "Yes." I said, "Well, that's where I sit normally." "Oh," she said, "are you a judge?" I said, "Yes." "Oh," she said, "can I ask you a question?" "No," I said, "I'm off duty today." but there we go. So that in brief is the situation about the courts. I think that probably gives you sufficient of an insight, and we'll now move on to tribunals. What are tribunals? Most of you, I suspect, have never heard of them or never had much to do with them. A lot of people don't even know where they are, because they're normally in a building without any big indication on the front door as to who they are, what they are, where they are. The tribunal that I used to adjudicate looked at several different benefits paid by the government. Universal credit, that's made a lot of news lately because of the weaknesses in the system. Income support, job seekers allowance, employment and support allowance, personal independence payment, attendance allowance. Some of you may be getting attendance allowance. Housing benefit, and appeals against a child support agency. If I tell you that the basic textbooks on these laws are like this, and there's 5 of them, there's an awful lot to know. In those circumstances, it's not uncommon for the judge to sit with members of the tribunal who can be medical experts, disability experts, financial experts, sitting as 2, sometimes 3. What they deal with is normally the more vulnerable people in the community, people at the lower end of the socio-economic scale, people who apply for benefits normally because they have no other way of supporting themselves. It may be that they're not working for various health reasons. It may be because of age, disability, all sorts of things. And one gets a wide variety. It's not at all uncommon to have an interpreter in court, not because mein English is as I nicht geht, but rather because they come from different parts of the world, and I mean an incredible variety of the world. And obviously they need support to make themselves understood. However, some of it does give rise to a little bit of amusement. Let me tell you the story about the armless man. Now, it depends whether you say armless with an H at the front or not. This is how it goes. Gentleman appeals because the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which we all call the DWP, had refused his claim for benefits when he wasn't working. What was the basis of the claim? The basis of the claim was that he had no use of his upper limbs. That is to say, which is, pardon me, that is to say his hands, his wrists and his arms. So he came into the tribunal room, followed by the clerk who carried his coat for him. And he sat down and he told us this miser, as they say, this story about his difficulty with his upper limbs. So the doctor sitting with me asked him a whole series of medical questions, and as I was sitting there listening to it, you know how sometimes in the back of your mind you think, this just doesn't sound true, doesn't sound right. So when the doctor finished, I thanked him, and I said to the man, I noticed that you're clean shaven. He said, yes. I said, I know it may appear strange for me with a beard to ask you, but do you dry shave or wet shave? And he said, I wet shave. I said, do you wet shave very often? Well, he said, the wife gets a bit uppity about it, so I do it 3 or 4 days a week. Right, I said, and do you have any difficulty shaving? No, he said, I don't. He was getting a bit tetchy then. He said, no, I don't. He said, what are you asking me these stupid questions about shaving for? Well, I said, to my little mind, someone who's got no use of the upper limbs would cut their face to pieces if they couldn't use a razor properly. There was a silence for a second, and he looked at me and he says, you've caught me, haven't you? No, I said, you've caught yourself. I said, if you'd have told me that your wife applied an electric razor to your face, I would have believed it. Oh, he said, there's no point in me sitting here any longer. Got up, picked up his coat and walked out the door. And the doctor said, what made you think of that? I said, I've no idea, but it just didn't sound right. Now, that's an unusual case, and you shouldn't, for any reason, think that I'm saying that a lot of people are fraudulent claimants, but you get these sorts of things, and part of the intellectual exercise of being the judge is to look into what's going on and think about whether it has a credibility, a hallmark of verisimilitude that would enable the person to come on. We had a lovely couple, an elderly Jewish couple from northwest London, I'll tell you no more than that, who'd applied for housing benefit, and they'd conveniently forgotten that they owned about half a dozen properties that they rented out, and therefore they had a considerable income coming in, which put them well outside the housing benefit bracket. And when the local authority, London Borough of Camden, I think it was, refused the claim, they rather mistakenly appealed. Not only that, but they engaged the services of a lawyer, which I'm sure wasn't cheap, and they came along to appeal. And I said, well, who owns these properties? Well, we don't, they said. I said, right, well, who owns them? They're in the name of a company. Okay, I said, who are the directors of the company? We are. I said, who are the shareholders in the company? We are. Game, set and match. End of. And if the solicitor had thought to ask the questions before they arrived, they could have saved themselves the journey to the tribunal. But there we are. That's it. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Child Support Agency appeals. And I know that there's at least one of my former colleagues looking in. I'm not allowed to name you, Rosemary, but thank you for attending this afternoon. And Harvey, if you're there, welcome to you too, but I'm not going to name you either. So they are retired accountants who sit as expert members of the tribunal. And I'm just going to tell you 2 very quick stories. You see, I'm sure you understand what the Child Support Agency is, or it's now called the Child Maintenance Service. It's the same thing with a different label and probably costing more. So you'll have to have a male and a female. They don't have to be married or anything like that. The female has a child by the male, That's the normal biological thing, in case anybody's wondering. And then the female wants the male to support the child, and the male says, for various reasons, either no, or I'm not paying as much as the child support agency adjudicates. So there's an appeal, and I was one of the few London judges that used to hear these appeals. And on one occasion, the male turned out to be an accountant. Okay? Doesn't automatically mean he's rich. Not all accountants are. So we started asking him about his finances, and he told us what he was earning, but he was a bit cagey about his capital. So I said to him, I noticed on the list you don't show a holding of premium bonds. And he shifted in his chair a bit. And I said, I thought you might have some. Well, he said, I do, but they're not in my name. Oh, I said, can you explain? Well, he said, I had the £50,000 maximum holding, but I didn't want her, referring to the female, I didn't want her to know. So I got a pal of mine to take them in his name, and we have a little arrangement about sharing any prizes. Right, I said. Are you aware of the terms and conditions on buying premium bonds, that you have to have them in your own name? Oh, yes, he said, but I wasn't going to let her have the benefit of any of it. Well, I said, I wonder what your institute would have to say if they found out about all of that. At which point his face went the colour of chalk, and I said, I think we'll take a little break there. You might want to go out and consider your position. We came back 5 minutes later and said, I'd like to withdraw my appeal. Game, sat and match again. The other one was down in Colchester, and the gentleman was a self-employed painter and decorator. Nothing wrong with that. And so my financial expert said to him, well, how do you deal with your income that you disclose to the revenue? And he said, well, when I get paid by cheque, I pay that into the bank, and that's what goes down as my earnings. Right, but what about any cash that you receive? Oh, well, that goes in my pocket, and I use it to pay bills and buy food and so on and so forth. Question, how do you account to the revenue for the cash? Oh, they don't need to know about that. No, don't worry. That's nothing to do with them. At which point the steam came out the ears of the financial expert, who very pointedly explained to him that all income is accountable. He went out and thought about his position, and he also came back and withdrew his appeal. It is quite extraordinary what people get away with or think they're going to get away with, but it's all interesting stuff. Let's move on and talk a little bit about IT. Now, I suspect most of us here this afternoon didn't grow up in the computer age. I certainly didn't. But judges these days are expected either to be computer literate or at least to acquire basic knowledge, because judgments are now typed. You have to type your own. There's nobody to type them for you. A lot of judges keep a record of what's going on in court or tribunal on a laptop, not writing it all down as was in the past. And they have to be able to use the machinery. At the end of tribunal hearings, we type up a brief form of decision, which we have to use a form for on a PC at the tribunal venue. So it's very important not only for judges to be up to date with the law, but up to date with digital developments. And in fact, recently, because of the COVID difficulties, a number of tribunal appeals, at least, are being dealt with by not Zoom, but one of the other companies. And so the judge and the members sit in their own homes, like I am now, with a laptop screen and see the other parties all there, but not present physically. Somewhat unusual, but it's a development. I will just tell you one little story about the last day I sat as a judge. And well, we had a chap in, I can't remember what it was, but the court was set up with a screen, and one of the screens had the defendant, and one of the screens had a picture of his lawyer. And nobody had given me the name of the lawyer. So I said to him, I'm awfully sorry, I haven't got your name. Can you tell me what it is? And he answered, my name is Tom Jones. And with great difficulty, I resisted the temptation to say, it's not unusual. But I decided it was probably not the time and the place. And he'd probably had that for the last 25 years of his life, and he wouldn't necessarily welcome it. We also had a youth in court. Now, youths normally appear in something called the youth court. Bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? But if there's no youth court sitting and it's urgent, they put them in the adult court. So we had a youth. And I said to the clerk, what's his name, just before he comes up from the cells? She had a look and giggled, and she said, his name is Harrison Ford. Whether this was all set up for my last day or not, I don't know. Anyway, in comes this 16-year-old, very fine young fellow he was, and we dealt with him and sorted him out. And I bailed him out, and I said, and one other thing, I said, you can now go back and make a few extra films. So he laughed, he said, I get that all the time. He said, my parents thought it was funny. I've long lost the sense of fun with a name like that. Ah, sweet. Well, at 16, he's probably got another 70 or 80 years to walk around with that. You might want to change the Harrison to Jaime or something like that, because Jaime Ford is likely to be less controversial. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I've been talking to you for 40 minutes. Some of you, I think, may still be awake. And I'm going to open it at this stage to questions. There is one question that I always get, and I can tell you the answer is yes. So don't bother to ask the question. Right, Stuart, is this where you come back into play as the master of ceremonies?
I will try to do that. We have to find a way of people just coming in. Ronnie, if you can spot people who have questions to ask. I'm just going to ask one myself to start with. Can I just ask, in a magistrate's court, I know for magistrates who probably don't have the level of training that you as a judge have, they always have a legal advisor or
correct
clerk of the court. Bearing in mind the level of information that you need to be able to make decisions, do you have somebody sitting alongside you as a legal advisor to help you through this?
What we get is somebody, it's a very good question. What we get is somebody called a court associate. Now, a court associate is not legally qualified. The court service worked out a long time ago that if someone's been appointed as a judge, they really ought to know enough to get on with it without someone sitting down there saying, oh, don't forget this, don't forget that. So the court associate is more than a note taker. The court associate has a basic grounding in court procedure, but certainly cannot offer legal advice, and in fact is not allowed to do so. But it is a very helpful member of the court scheme.
Okay, thank you.
It's not unknown, by the way, Stuart, it's not unknown for some court associates to decide to progress and pass examinations to become legal advisors in court.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ronnie, can you perhaps take everybody off mute and see if anybody wants to come in and ask some questions? And thank you for that very entertaining and very interesting talk. It's amazing what people try and get away with. And we read about them in the press almost every day, don't we? In terms of
I will say this, Stuart, I agree with you. It was entertaining and interesting. Right, let's have some questions. Let's see who's awake. Leslie, oh no, perhaps not. Yes, Leslie. Unmute yourself.
I know, there we go. Right, yeah, Shlomo, very interesting. I mean, I know that you mentioned about interpreters in court and such like, but I know that you personally speak a number of languages fluently. Have you ever had occasion when you've had to use any of your languages, particularly Yiddish, in court?
As it happens, ja, avada, richtig sein, richtig gesucht, whatever that means. Yes, I have. I've used French, I've used German, but let me tell you a story that one of my colleagues told me recently. This is absolutely true. He sits as an immigration judge, and the lady making the appeal came from Nigeria. And you may or may not know that there are two languages spoken in Nigeria, either Igbo or Yoruba. So he strunsed into court, and there was the lady. Again, nothing racist, obviously a black lady from Nigeria. And there was the interpreter, a white male. So he said to the interpreter, have you introduced yourself to the appellant yet? And the interpreter said no. He said, well, do you want to go and do that first? So the interpreter walked over to the lady and spoke to her, and she looked completely puzzled. And he spoke to her again, and she just shook her head, indicating she didn't understand. So my chum said to him, is there a problem? The interpreter said, yes. He said, I'm talking to her and she doesn't seem to understand me. So my chum looked at the court file and said, are you a Yoruba interpreter? Yoruba, said the man. No, he said, I'm a Yiddish interpreter. Obviously, someone had gone down the menu on the computer list and Yiddish and Yoruba were next to each other, hit the wrong one, and thus you had a Yiddish interpreter talking to a Yoruba-speaking lady. And he couldn't wait to get out of tribunal and ring me and tell me that. I thought it was very funny. One has to be careful, Leslie, and you hit an interesting point, that one doesn't descend into the arena in any way and become part of the proceedings. And thus, when I've used my linguistic abilities, which are much more limited than you think, it's only been in a case of necessity.
It started up.
Can you keep quiet at the back, please?
Somebody keep quiet there, please.
Yes, otherwise you'll be in Gahatta stores, as they say in French. For example, at Thames Court a few months ago, we had a gentleman from France who was in custody, and for some reason they couldn't produce a French interpreter. So by the time we got to about 3:30, I said, right, I said, get him up. And they brought him up from the cells, and I explained to him what was going on in French, obviously, and what was going to happen, and that he'd be back the next day because there was no interpreter. And the advocates sat with their mouths open. And he said that was a master class. I said, not really. I said, if you speak the language, it's like Chris Tarrant used to say, if you know the answers, the questions are easy. And so if you understand the language, it's no big deal. I have done it in Yiddish, I've done it in German, French. I think that's about the height of it. Oh, I've used English once or twice as well for those who are at the difficult end. Right, next question.
Can you see me?
Peter.
Can you see me?
Just give your name and the question and we'll find you.
And your bank account details. Oh, there he is. Yes.
You're on silent. You're on silent.
You'll have to unmute yourself, old boy. Put another shilling in the meter. There's a good chap.
No, unmute. Okay, I'm unmuted.
Yeah,
That's
you're
better.
Right,
Carry
okay.
on.
Speak up.
Your Lordship, going back many years when you were just starting and they were allowing you to fly solo, your first case on the bench, did you feel it had apprehensive and nervous?
Well, that's very interesting you asked that. My very first sitting in court was at Marylebone Court, which doesn't exist anymore, and it was on my 43rd birthday, so it was an easy day to remember. And I arrived at the court, and I was told that I had a day's trial under the Dangerous Dogs Act. Well, I did say that maybe it should have been moved to Barking Court, but I will leave that one. I thought to myself, this does not sound very exciting. And indeed, it wasn't. And I walked home and I thought, has this been such a clever move after all? But things got better from there. And so, yeah, I survived the ordeal. Some days are better than others. Some are more interesting than others. Some give you a real buzz, to use a modern word. Others are deadly dull. Some advocates are interesting. Some of them, frankly, you can do without. I always see it as an intellectual challenge to see if I can see where they're going. And in fact, in recent years, I've started doing something very naughty. And a defence advocate will get up to make a speech. And I'd say, I'm guessing that what you're going to say is that he comes from a broken home. He was living with his grandma who died recently. His pet dog has run away. And he's forgotten to have his mezuzahs checked, and that's what you're telling me. And I get a look and say, well, yes. I said, right, well, that saved us 20 minutes. Now let's cut to the chase, shall we? And it would normally create a smile, but it sort of move things along. You should understand that in some courts, the number of people on the list is incredible. And the workload you're supposed to get through in the course of a day. My record was at a court in Camberwell in South London, where on a Monday morning, we had every waif and stray from the weekend, the Noschleppers and the Unterpressers all coming along. I think I had 55 people walk past me in the course of a day. And it's not the sort of thing where you can say, well, it's 4 o'clock, I've had enough. The rest of them can come back tomorrow. They have to be dealt with on the day. And when I finished, it was getting on for 6 o'clock in the evening, which from 10 in the morning with a half-hour break for lunch was a long day. But you get a sense of achievement as well, that you get the work done and you sort the people out one way or another. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, thank you very much.
My pleasure. The bill will follow. Next question.
Anybody else there?
You can't all be shrinking violets. Daphne, I bet you've got something to ask.
Jasmine's got a question and Jeremy Gasson's got a question, but they need to unmute themselves.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, let's see where we go.
That's Jasmine.
Go on, Jasmine.
That's Jasmine.
Carry on.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Can I just ask you your personal opinion of the programs on television, like Judge John Deed and Judge Rinder, who I don't believe is an actual judge, but he does very good whatever programs. What is your opinion of the way that they present judges?
Oh, that's a good question. Right, let's start with the rather obvious, and that is that these things are hyped up for entertainment and for the viewers. That's where you've got to start, particularly in the case of Robert Rinder, who is a barrister but not actually a judge. Let's come to John Deed.
Yeah.
I envy that man. I envy him, not for his good looks or anything, because I've got my own, but I envy him because he gets to say all sorts of things in court that even I know would cross a boundary that should not be crossed. And if you're a fan of his programs or his episodes, you will have noticed a little thing that appears once every episode. He'll be sitting in court and an advocate will get up to make a point, and he says, "But surely you're aware of section 72B 1CA of the Representation of the Frogs Act 1907, which says this, that and the other," as if the man is a walking encyclopedia of the law. And I love it when he does that. He, I think, gives a more serious presentation of a judge in court. And I think of the two that you mentioned, he's good. I'm surprised you didn't mention Judge Judy, who everybody mentions.
Yeah.
Now, Judge Judy is, of course, American, so that says enough. Is a law unto herself. But let me put it this way. You get to a point with adequate experience that you can see how matters are going to pan out. You can see how things are going to go on. And if you want to get the thing moving, instead of waiting for someone to tell you something, you can jump 2 or 3 steps ahead and work it from there. Does that assist you, madam?
Hello.
Thank you.
Was somebody else with a question?
Jeremy.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Jeremy.
Yeah, am I on?
Yes, go on, Jeremy.
Judge, before I ask the direct question, can I preface it with a story that I've never had 100% certainty it's true. Many years ago, I had a very good friend who was a garage mechanic of his own garage, and he was asked to attend a case as an expert witness to a traffic offence. At the crossroads at Stonebridge Park, a guy was crossing in his car on the green, and the car came from the right-hand side and hit him crossing on the red, or so the story goes.
Right.
And the judge asked the defendant what happened. He said, "Well, it was like this. This guy was crossing on the red, and I was crossing on the green, which was totally contrary to what was the apparent truth." And he said, "What are you doing? Don't you know what you're doing?" And I said, "Well, I was crossing on the green." And then the judge said, "Is that the exact language that was used?" To which he replied, "No, it wasn't actually that, but there's ladies in the court, and in those days the court stenographer, and as such she wouldn't like the language that was used." He said, "Don't worry about that." And it turned out that they were effing and blinding like crazy, at which point the chap who was shall we say the non-guilty party was so incensed of what was turning out to be the lies, he turned around and shouted to his barrister, "That's all a load of bloody lies." At which point the judge said, "I won't have that language in court." My question is that possibly true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've heard language in court which would make your hair curl if you still had it. And so, nothing personal, old chap. But the fact is that you have to hear what you have to hear. And people's expressions, the powers of their expressions, the passion of their expressions, together with their body language, make a lot of difference. Now, when I used to sit and listen to witnesses giving evidence, not only was I listening to what they had to say, which was important, but how they said it and how they stood in the witness box giving that evidence. And it made an awful lot of difference. And it didn't take long before you could... Shall I tell you how you can work out the truth from a lie?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So the person is standing, like I'm looking at you now. Neither of us are pretty sight, but don't worry about that. So I'm looking at you directly now, and I'm telling you that this and this happened last Wednesday fortnight outside Edgware Station. Or I'm looking a little bit into the distance, telling you the story. If I'm looking a little bit into the distance, telling you the story, I'm mentally rerunning the video of what happened. And I'm putting my mind back to what I saw on that occasion. If I'm looking directly at you, there's far more of a chance that I'm compiling the story as I go along. That is something that psychologists have worked out. It's not what I'm saying. It's something that psychologists have worked out. Very interesting. If someone's calm and they've got their hands on the edge of the witness box and they're just gently relating it to you, rather than shifting around from foot to foot and all that, then again, there's far more likelihood that they're telling the truth.
But the question was, is
Hello.
Go on, no, let Jeremy carry on. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Carry on, Jeremy. Good name for a film.
what I was asking you, Judge, was that the story was that the guy was furious at what was being said by
Yes, I heard what you said, and I agree it's quite possible that what you told us actually occurred, yes.
So it could be a true story.
Well, if you think about it, the bad language was part of the evidence of what happened. But beyond that, there was no need for any ill comments. And the judge was quite right to reprimand the person speaking in that way.
So, oh gosh.
Okay, somebody else got a question?
Stanley, yes.
Go on, Stanley.
Yeah, hello, Judge.
Stanley?
Can I ask you, when you've had people in front of you and they've had to take the oath, has there been any unusual requests for this? I'll tell you why, if I may. I once heard a story when a guy came up before a judge and was a bit Jack the Lad, and he told them that he was a Buddhist, and they had to find out how he was going to take the oath. And it transpired they have to take a plate, smash it on the ground, and say, "My soul will be smashed to pieces as this plate has." So you just wanted to make it as difficult as possible for the court to follow his
There are some that have the, I don't know, would I say religious belief or whatever it is, that they have a saucer of feathers and they set light to the feathers and they say, may my soul burn forever like these feathers if I tell a lie. I'm not sure which crowd they belong to, probably Charlton Athletic. But, there are all sorts of things. No, I've never had anything unusual. What happens is that the person comes into the witness box and the usher says to them, "Do you have a religious belief?" If they say no, then they affirm. In other words, I solemnly sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence I give should be the truth, blah, blah, blah. If they say yes, then the usher will ask them what the religious belief is and then produce the appropriate holy book for them to use. Much, I suspect, to a lot of people's surprise here today, you might be interested to know that if a Jewish person comes into court to give evidence, they must affirm they do not take the oath on the Old Testament.
No, I'm supposed to.
There you go, that's your answer. But I've never had anything unusual like that happen.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions for Judge?
Hello, can I speak?
Yes, who's that?
Irvin.
Go on, Irving, carry on.
Yeah, I wondered, a fascinating afternoon, I must say, listening to this. I wondered if you have, by any chance, taken part or observed a Beth Din court, and how you would compare the Beth Din court with the English court that you yourselves have sat in.
That's a very good question, thank you. I've only ever once appeared in front of a Beth Din. As there may be one or two people here this afternoon, former colleagues who are not of the Jewish faith, let me just explain that the Beth Din is a religious court presided over by Dayanim. Dayanim are the judges, but who are qualified in religious law. The only time I appeared in front of a Beth Din was when I was approached by a rabbinical colleague, and the head of that particular organisation's Beth Din had it in for him and wanted to get him sacked. And the head of the Beth Din found out that this rabbi had done something which, although technically was probably in breach of the rules, wasn't the worst thing. And so he was summoned to appear to show cause why he should not be dismissed from his rabbinical position. And he approached me to assist him. I can see I've got everybody's attention now. So we spoke about it at length and we devised a scheme. Fortunately, this rabbi was a friend of mine, the head of the Beth Din. If I never saw him again, it wouldn't be too soon. We had a mutual affection, let's put it that way. So we turned up at the Beth Din. They didn't know I was coming with him. And we were taken into the chamber where the Dayanim presided. And I was announced as representing the rabbi. So the head of the Beth Din, I'm being very careful so that you don't work out who and what is involved, said to the rabbi, Rabbi so-and-so, the accusation against you is da-da-da-da-da-da-da. What do you have to say? And by prior arrangement, I told the rabbi to keep his trap shut. And I handed up a statement and I said, worthy Dayanim, this is a statement presented on behalf of Rabbi X, and this is what he has to say. So they read the statement, and then the head of the Beth Din said, yes, that's all very well, but Rabbi, what do you have to say? And I said, I'll tell you again. The statement is what the rabbi has to say. He has nothing to add. So the Dayanim looked at each other, and I said, would it be appropriate for us to withdraw for 10 minutes to allow you to consider the situation? And they agreed. And when we came back, the head of the Beth Din said, we think we can see a way forward to resolving this problem. Jolly good show. And everybody went away happy. But to answer, I'm sorry, is it Stanley who's asked the question?
Irvin.
Irvin, I do apologise.
No.
My apologies. Okay. Irvin, oh, that's better. I can see you now. My goodness. What a young, frisky face there. So, to answer your question, I've never taken part in proceedings. The Beth Din, any Beth Din, is recognised as a court of arbitration. It's a little bit like the small claims court of a county court or a tribunal. But when they make decisions, let's say an award of a financial favour, of a financial nature in favour of somebody, they of course have no powers of enforcement. And their order has to be enforced through the English court system. And that's why I'm saying that the English courts recognise the Beth Din as a court of arbitration and will enforce those awards.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you.
I'll take one more.
One more?
Or maybe two. Who's counting? Oh, there's a lady waving her hand. Madam.
You're on silent. You're on silent.
All
All
right.
right, should be all right.
Right.
now.
No,
You're
you're
okay
on.
now.
Hi. Very
Carry
quick
on.
question, and probably very easy to answer. Did you take early retirement or did you retire when they wanted you to retire?
Oh, that would be telling.
That's a lovely accent. May I ask where you're from?
I was an interpreter in court, so
That's not the answer. The question was, where are you
That's where
from?
came from.
where I come from, that's I was born in Belgium, Antwerp.
Vous parlez en français aussi?
Oui.
Ah, d'accord, magnifique.
Oh,
Oh, très ravi de vous entendre.
keep it.
Send around.
Now, do you want the answer in French or English?
Can we keep it clean, please?
Certainly not.
I'm a
Okay, the
Yiddish-
answer is this. A judge can work up to the age of 70.
Yeah, that's right.
I think they used to get appointed at that age, but anyway, that's beside the point. Well, you had to be 70 and senile to get the job, I think. It's all changed now. So seriously, you can work until 70, but you can retire from the age of 65. What's the difference? The difference is purely financial in that the pension does not grow any larger after the age of 65. So you may get paid for what you're doing, but it doesn't enhance the pension. And I came to the conclusion as I reached 65 and saw the pension terms that it was adequate to live on and that I may as well wave them farewell. I suspect they probably made a kiddish when I went, but let's not get too personal.
They don't want to it.
Okay.
C'est la bonne réponse, madame?
Merci
Merci.
bien.
Yes.
Merci bien.
Okay,
Merci.
was there one more
Let's
coming?
see, one more question. If
Yes,
not,
no? Speak up.
I've got one more if nobody else has.
Okay, and then I'll tell you the answer, the question to which I told you the answer before.
Brian Nathan's got a question.
Okay, go on,
Okay.
Brian. Go to me.
Go
Go on,
on.
Brian.
Yeah, I managed to unmute myself. It's a very easy question, so it won't take you a moment. My son has told me various stories about working on a tribunal and with the particular people. Did you ever work with Dr. Jeremy Nathan?
Very often. I'm in regular touch with him.
Right, okay, well then that's where the stories come from, and they're lovely.
Jeremy Nathan is a doctor. They did until recently live in Hendon and now live in Renana. He's a very bright character and very good dealing with people. And it was always a great play. The other good thing was living in Edgware, if we worked together, I normally got a lift home. So that did make life a lot better. Now go on, Stuart, you can have the last question.
I just wanted to ask you about your involvement in appeals on continuing healthcare. I mentioned to you in my email the other day
You did.
that I am a non-executive director on a clinical commissioning group.
Right.
And one of our big areas in growth has been the money that people request to support when a relative is going into a nursing home, which is very expensive business these days, and they want financial assistance either from the NHS or from social care.
Correct.
Now, they put a request in. Sometimes it comes back fully granted, other times partially granted or not granted at all. And therefore, it's quite a emotional process for people when relatives are in a nursing home. Now, I have sat in on appeal panels just because I wanted to see what happened and the experience of that. And I see these are usually done by professional people in NHS terms. I have sat in on an appeal where somebody came along with a solicitor to help them, but I didn't know that they could come before a judge if necessary. So what level of work would that entail for you?
Okay, I hope everybody's followed that, because it's a rather unusual area that many people may not be familiar with, but you've given a very good outline, Stuart, so I don't think I need to add any more to the question. The appeal panel that you would have seen would have been 3 people. There's the chair, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There is normally a director of social services or an equivalent from a different borough to the one involved in the appeal. Another member is normally some sort of clinical expert, and there may also be a medical advisor sitting with the panel, but not as a member of the panel, who can be anybody from a consultant downwards. Now, who the chair is, it does not necessarily have to be a judicial person. When I saw the ad for the London district, it was in the Sunday Times about 4 years ago. It apparently only appeared there, and I don't normally buy a Sunday paper, but I just happened to and saw it. Cut a long story short, they had 1,400 applications. Of those, they interviewed 17. Of those, they appointed 6, and I was one of the 6. I was the only one who was a judge, but I think they liked the fact that I had that experience, and also sitting in a tribunal, I understood about disabilities, care needs, and so on. And I think that's what got me the job, apart from my stunning personality and looks and sense of humour. So I did it for a couple of years, and it was a very interesting experience. I better be careful what I say. I left because of procedural difficulties I kept coming across in the organisation at the NHS, and I decided that it just wasn't going to be for me. The CCGs always send a representative. As you quite rightly say, every person making an appeal is making it on behalf of somebody else, because that person is inevitably in a nursing home or a care home or whatever it is, and they are perfectly entitled to have representation. It doesn't have to be professional, like a lawyer. It can be a lay representative. And as you probably saw, they get sent in advance the bundle of papers that the tribunal, the panel members get, a good wodge of papers, which will include medical assessments, claim forms, doctors, all sorts of stuff. And it's a very interesting and worthwhile thing. The one thing we never find out on the panel is the amount of money involved. That's something that's never disclosed to us because it's not relevant. We're there to decide whether the person meets the criteria for an award. And what happens after that is not our business at all.
Okay.
Does that help you?
Absolutely interesting. I'm
just going to say the question I've been expecting, to which the answer is yes, and nobody's asked today, is, would I restore the death penalty?
Oh, good, yeah.
And the answer is yes, without a shadow of a doubt. And I have a list of people who would be victims. First one, my tax inspector. The second one, my bank manager. Well, the list could go on.
You're not vindictive then?
Not at all.
Okay.
I'll sort you out later, Bloom.
Okay. Shlomo, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting afternoon. Just before I finally close, one thing I meant to mention at the beginning, on the programme we've sent you for September, you will see that on the 22nd of September, we've got the first round with Brian, Nathan on our Desert Island Discs. Those people who are going to be involved in the first session, Marlene will be writing to Marlene in the next week or so, is that? Okay, so that you're around.
Yes, I will. I'll be speaking to them within, at the beginning of September, at the beginning.
Okay. Yeah. We want to make sure that you're around on the 22nd so you can do your bit and contribute towards the programme. Okay, as the judge is about to leave the court, all rise. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a real pleasure, and I wish you all a silver Simatova a good year ahead.
And to you too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Daphne. Thank you very much, Shlomo. Judge.
Thank you so much.
Very, very.
God bless. See you soon, people.
Simon, I'll see you tomorrow.
I'm afraid so.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye. If you want to stay and chat amongst yourselves, please feel free to do so.